love. Most people who look at the life of Jesus and the larger story of God told in the Bible agree that one of, if not the central message of the Bible is love. That God is love, that we as a part of this ongoing story, we are to love. Love God and love our neighbor. Yet we're living in a cultural and political climate that throws around labels and even blame to the very people Jesus calls neighbor. These are the very ones we are to love, to engage with, to invite to the table. The very folks we would call them, Jesus invites us to see as us. This fall at Salt House, our conversation explores this line between us and them, asking, what does it mean to become we? Join the conversation as Jesus' example informs our understanding of our privilege, of our intimacy, our systems and divisions within our own families, how to address online shaming, and how to join the conversation on racial injustice. We'll let God pull us out of our comfort zones to recognize the filters and biases we carry for the sake of being people who love ourselves and love others like Jesus does. On the journey of becoming we, the radical act of loving our neighbor together. If you were here last week, you saw some of our preliminary efforts at that video. I feel like this one turned out well. So friends, yes, this fall we are treading into important territory, venturing into this conversation we're calling Becoming We, a conversation very much formed by where we find ourselves as a new community here at Salt House in the next few weeks, as our basement will open as a day center for families experiencing homelessness. We've named how we want this to be an experience of becoming we with the folks who benefit from the day center, and that really, that mindset, that identity, that would fuel the very way in which we engage with the world. To know ourselves and our biases, and to let God meet us in those places to transform how we see the world and the unique people that we share this world with. So this past week that we've lived through was, if you were paying attention, this was another week in which we have every reason to do this hard, urgent work of becoming we. Another week of racism and death and black bodies being treated differently than how white bodies are treated. Terrence, Crutcher, and Lamont Scott. As Jesus-following people, it is timely and it is necessary and urgent for us to have this conversation that we were already planning to have today, which is a conversation around privilege and power. So today we get to ask this question: how does the Jesus story influence us? How does the Jesus story influence these dynamics of our own privilege? And what do we do about it? Are you willing to take that leap with me into this big question? You willing to go there? All right, game on. Let's just take a deep breath and pray. God, we do breathe deeply as we settle into this time, opening ourselves up to the hope and the possibility that you have for us and for our world. And with deep humility, we name that we are people who don't have answers to this, yet who long to see transformation, to see healing, to see racial reconciliation, to see peace. So God, may what we say and experience now move us into this trajectory you have for making your vision of this world a reality. All this in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So as we begin this conversation about privilege, I want to begin by engaging our brains first by going to definitions. So defining this word privilege, what it is, what it means, and how we use it. When words are thrown around a lot in the media, it's good to actually stop and go, wait a minute, what do we mean when we actually say that? So let's look at that. So I want to offer two definitions of privilege. The first is from a scholar and researcher. Her name's Peggy McIntosh, and this has been around for a while, so a lot of people have used this. But I appreciate because she talks about privilege as unpacking the invisible knapsack. like an invisible backpack that's filled with resources that we get to carry around. So Peggy, she was specifically here in the quote that I'm going to use, she's talking about white privilege specifically, but it really carries over into other categories of privilege as well. So this is what she says. She says, I have come to see white privilege as an invisible package of unearned assets that I can count on cashing in each day, but about which I was meant to remain oblivious. Notice that. White privilege is like an invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions. Look at this list. Assurances, tools, maps, guides, code books, passports, visas, clothes, compass, emergency gear, and blank checks. Does that resonate for you? I mean, I just read that and I go, yes, that is so helpful. That image of this invisible backpack, this knapsack, that privilege affords unseen, unlimited resources for us that we are meant to remain oblivious to. So that's one. So let's move this conversation from definitions then to making it a little bit more personal and tangible. And I want to take time to name ways in which we have that invisible knapsack and ways in which we don't. So kinds of privilege that are out there. You see, you and me together every day, we're breathing the cultural air where certain groups of people are considered privileged while another group is not. And we know that. And in the United States, there historically are recognized privileged and oppressed communities of people. And I have a list of 12 identities that are privileged with their corresponding oppressed group. And I'm going to ask you to be a little bit vulnerable, to take a bit of a risk with this, because I'm going to read through this list of privilege. And as I name off this list, I'm going to ask you to, if this is an identity that defines you, if it's who you are, to actually stand. And I invite you to stand up, that's saying, yep, that's who I am. And then I'll invite you to sit, and then we'll go on to the next one. So just people to kind of be sitting and standing as we go through and name these 12 identities. So for those who have difficulty standing, raising your hand is also okay. If you just want to stay seated, totally get that. Okay, but are you willing? I mean, I understand there's a little bit of risk in this. Are you willing to go there? And of course, you can always just stay seated the whole time if you don't want to go there, and totally okay. So I do want you to pay attention to how often you stand. And actually, it might be easier to count the number of times that you don't stand, because I think most of us will be standing a lot. And pay attention essentially then to how much privilege you have in the eyes of our society. And some of this, again, it may feel vulnerable for folks, so feel free to just sit if you need to. And also, if there's one where it's like, I don't know that. Like, if it's hard to choose, just go with your gut. Even if picking one of the labels is you're like, actually, I would qualify that differently. Just kind of go with whatever is kind of closest if you're in that kind of space. All right, so, and for people who are watching on the video, I hope that they'll be standing up and sitting down also, because that would be awesome. Anyway, so these are not my categories, but they are ones that are recognized in the United States. All right, so here we go. So my friends, please stand if you are someone who holds the privileged identity of being an adult aged 30 to 55. So the oppressed identity is being young or being an elder. Interesting. All right, please sit. Please stand if you are someone who holds the privileged identity of being a man. The oppressed identity of being a woman or a person targeted by sexism is the other side of this. Thank you. You can sit down. Please stand if you are someone who holds the privileged identity of being white. The oppressed identity is being a person of color. Please be seated. Please stand if you are someone who holds the privileged identity of being gender conforming or cisgender. The oppressed identity is being gender nonconforming or trans. And if these are unfamiliar terms to you, you should be standing, because it means you identify as a typical, like, that's my gender, male or female, it's that easy, you know, but it's not. You're gender conforming. So the oppressed identity is being gender nonconforming or trans. You may be seated. Please stand if you are someone who holds the privileged identity of being a person without disability, able-bodied. The oppressed identity is being differently abled. Please be seated. Please stand if you are someone who holds the privileged identity of being heterosexual. The oppressed identity is being lesbian, gay, bisexual, or queer. Please be seated. Please stand if you are someone who holds the privileged identity of being Christian. The oppressed identity is being non-Christian. Please be seated. Please stand if you are someone who holds the privileged identity of being someone who owns property, being middle class. The oppressed identity is being low income or working class. You may be seated. Please stand if you are someone who holds the privileged identity of being born in the USA. The oppressed identity is being born outside of the United States. Please be seated. Please stand if you are someone who holds the privileged identity of having a socially acceptable body size and weight. The oppressed identity is body size and weight that are not considered socially acceptable. I know, hard to draw that line. Please be seated. And please stand if you are someone who holds the privileged identity of being a native English speaker. Oppressed identity is being a non-native speaker. You had to learn English. It wasn't your first language. Please be seated. And finally, the last one, please stand if you are someone who holds the privileged identity of being a U.S. citizen. The oppressed identity is being a non-United States citizen. You may be seated. So my friends, what did you notice? Did anything surprise you? What did you notice about yourself? What did you notice about the amount of privilege in this room? I really appreciated the Pascals back there, like navigating like kids, asking, what does that mean? Like, okay, no, you're sitting there, you're standing, you're sitting. Like, that was awesome. So, and more conversations can happen later. So that was awesome to watch. But essentially, this is pointing us towards what kind of invisible knapsacks, like the resources that we get to carry around with us all the time, what amount of privilege we have, the advantages that we have because of these identities that we hold. And it was pretty powerful for me, I know, to work through this list the first time that I saw it. I was like, I had never thought of some of those areas. And I think there are more, too. I mean, I started thinking about, like, what about married and single? I think there's some dynamics there about privilege. And I know for me, I can stand up for every one of those except for being a man. And so if you are like me and remain seated for one or more, then like me, I would guess that, like me, you also have stories of times when you were discredited, forgotten, overlooked, silenced, or maybe even threatened or hurt or put in danger in some way. Times when we have experienced oppression, being unprivileged. So I wonder what stories we could tell. It is powerful and reorienting to actually name the privilege we have and the privilege we don't have. So I want to take this fresh awareness of our privilege and hold it alongside the gospel, the Jesus story, and look and ask how Jesus engaged with his own privilege and power in his own culture. So obviously we could, hopefully it's obvious, we could spend a lot of time talking about this. We could spend a week talking about the examples in Jesus' life. But we're going to turn to a few key passages in the New Testament, and we're going to hear it woven together in video featuring Christina Cleveland. She's a professor and author. It's one video in a series that she did on unity, and it's about 6 minutes. It's just kind of a casual conversation in a sense. It's filmed like in a room and where she's speaking at a conference. And she moves quickly and fluidly and pretty expertly through some of this territory, just into beautiful and challenging things for us. So I really invite you to kind of like tune in and like pay attention, because it really just it just goes. So as we listen, I invite you to grab hold of like, what's the one thing you want to like walk away with from this, or the two things like, oh man, that got me. So look for those things as we continue this conversation of how Jesus informs our power and our privilege.
I think one of the things that's interesting is, the church has really become so much like the empire that we just automatically value the people who look right or look culturally right, speak culturally right, have the opportunities and the capital. But Jesus was the opposite of that. Jesus spent pretty much all of his time standing in solidarity with the oppressed. I mean, it's so fun because this summer, about 5 friends and I got together every week and studied John's 7 signs. And in every single one of those signs, the people who are given the kind of sneak peek into what Jesus is doing, the deeper understanding of the implications of what Jesus is doing, they're always people who are marginalized in society. Starting in John 2 at the wedding at Cana, it's the servants who get to see Jesus actually perform the miracle. They're the ones who see Jesus' first miracle. And the wedding banquet guy, the guy who was running the wedding, it was all hearsay to him. He was like, wait, what happened? He was the one who didn't know what was really happening. And he had to go get that information from the servants. And so we just see like in all 7 of those signs that are supposed to tell us who Jesus really is, like John marks those signs as like, if you want to know who Christ is, like pay attention to these 7 miracles. Every single time it's Jesus showing the miracle to women, showing it to crippled, showing it to hungry people. I mean, another one is like when Jesus feeds 5,000, and you think there are 5,000 men there, so probably 20,000 people there, massive, massive, massive crowd of people. Who gets to see the miracle? It's the little boy who he's the one who actually gets to see Jesus multiply the loaves and the fishes. It's not the rich white guy. He doesn't have that kind of access. The only time Jesus was really saying anything to the rich white guys in his culture, he was typically rebuking them. So
Jesus wasn't wearing khakis?
No, Jesus wasn't. I mean, the one thing I do love about Jesus, though, is, in the story of Jairus, who had the sick daughter who's about to die, and Jesus stops to heal the woman who's dying, who's got the issue of bleeding. The thing I love about it is, like, Jesus puts Jairus on hold, heals the woman, draws attention to her, kind of uses his platform to show that this woman's important in their society, which I imagine the healing of her identity was probably even more meaningful than the healing of her issue. But then the good thing about Jesus is he still goes and heals Jairus' daughter, because Jesus loves white guys too. You know what I mean? So it's not that he's against people who are in power, but he has very strong words for people who are in power. And in what are you supposed to do with that power? How are you supposed to follow Jesus and abdicating it and leading it to the ground? I mean, Jesus was the most powerful person who walked on the earth, and he used his power in such a way, he redistributed his power in such a way that it led to his death. But it changed the world, and it also led to his resurrection and resurrection for all of us. So there's, when Paul talks about Jesus emptying himself and becoming humble and taking on the life of a slave in Philippians 2, and becoming a man, giving up his privileges as a deity, Paul's talking about how, like, we need to be just like Jesus. Like, that's the example that we need to follow. And, it's easy for someone like me to point to, like, white men, the upper middle class white guy. But, a lot of us, probably anybody who's watching this conversation, has some sort of power that they need to give up. And so for me, it's someone who's highly educated. I'm speaking at this conference here. I mean, I think I'm the only black woman who's speaking at it. But what gives me access?
I think you're the only black woman here.
Yeah, probably. I haven't seen any. I would have given that woman a hug if I had seen one. Yeah. But, what gives me access? Well, I actually am privileged when it comes to education. I have a PhD. People want to read my book. People want to hear me speak. Why? I mean, I live in a neighborhood full of people who never went to high school. Their perspectives on race and division in our society are like 10 times more brilliant than mine. But nobody's inviting them to come speak at their conferences. No one even wants to, if they wrote a blog, first of all, you'd have to have access to a computer, and you'd have to have internet and a bunch of other things. So it's something that we all really have to struggle with. Can you be a privileged person in our society who's not standing in solidarity with the oppressed and actually know Jesus? No, you can't. There's nothing to your faith if you're not standing in solidarity with the oppressed, because Jesus is with the oppressed. And you can't truly see Jesus except through the lens of the oppressed. I'm just a communist.
Isn't that good? I've watched it I've watched it a lot, and I'm like, God, she just packs so much stuff in there, and I wonder what grabbed you from that. If I just hang on to whatever the thing is that kind of sunk its teeth into you. But today, in this whole conversation around privilege, we have to name again, as Christina said, that Jesus spent so much of his time standing in solidarity with the oppressed, right? I love what she says about the 7 signs in John's gospel. So she names how John uses these 7 miracles that happen in his gospel that Jesus performs as this special way of revealing who God is, what the life of Jesus is like. And yes, only people who witness these miracles firsthand are those very people who are marginalized in that society. They get to see it. Don't you just love that? Like, who saw the feeding of the 5,000? Like, up close, it was the little boy who had no power in that society. Not the rich white guy. The people of power don't get that kind of access to Jesus. I love naming that. And that, my friends, is the pattern that is laid out before us, this invitation into life that looks like this. Christina mentions Philippians 2, where the Apostle Paul is writing this letter to the Christians in the city of Philippi, and he lays out, this is what Jesus did, and I want us to hear it as an invitation for us too. So our text for today is this passage from Philippians 2. It's recognized as a poem, as this song, like the way that the Philippians 2 is unfolding, it just like shifts form like tremendously right as it gets to this part. So it's this very like beautiful part of Philippians. And so Jason, come on up to read that. But I want you just to hear this in our conversation around privilege today. So it's just on the screen. It's not on our insert for those who like to look at that, but here we have it.
Philippians 2, verses 5 through 8. Think of yourselves the way Christ Jesus thought of himself. He had equal status with God, but didn't think so much of himself that he had to cling to the advantages of that status, no matter what. Not at all. When the time came, he set aside the privileges of deity and took on the status of a slave, became human. Having become human, he stayed human. It was an incredibly humbling process. He didn't claim special privileges. Instead, he lived a selfless, obedient life and then died a selfless, obedient death. The worst kind of death at that, a crucifixion.
This week, like me, were you met privilege that allows the suffering that we see, to not see it as our issue, as our own suffering. So Jesus, then, he sees suffering. He saw suffering every time, like what we saw this week, and in all these weeks that we've had in these past years. And he sees suffering systemically. He sees it in individuals. He sees that oppression happening, and he just went right into the middle of it. I love that comment in the video. I heard people chuckling about like what Jesus wasn't wearing khakis. It's like he could have been like the khaki wearing epitome of cultural privilege, but he gave it up. Jesus didn't wear khakis. He didn't look like someone who had power, but gave up his power as soon as he chose to be someone who stands in solidarity with the powerless. He gave up privilege for the sake of leveraging his privilege for the sake of those who didn't have it. My friends, were you heartbroken again this week by our headlines? By racism and black bodies treated differently than white bodies? Then I ask you, as surely as I ask myself, then what will we do today with the privilege that we have to stand alongside the oppressed? How will we leverage our privilege? Christina is right. The life of Jesus compels us to wrestle with, to struggle with what this looks like, to leverage the privilege that we have. There's no program to follow. It's not like a prescriptive, this is what you do and how you do it. We have to wrestle with it in our own unique lives, with the relationships we have, with the unique influence that we do have. But on its most basic level, it calls us to be aware of this cultural air that we are breathing. The invisible backpacks that we do get to carry around with us, those resources, those that we have, what others don't have. So there isn't a program, but here's one thing that I want us to try this week as we continue wrestling this out. So that list of the 12 identities of privilege and oppression, you may have already seen it, is printed on the backside of the insert in your bulletin. Please go through it again, read through it again, check which one is you, and then take it home and put it somewhere where you will see it, to be reminded of the kinds of folks whose voices are not being heard, and to recognize the privilege that you have that can be leveraged for the sake of the oppressed. I mean, it's pretty amazing the privilege, the power that we have, whether or not we want it, whether or not we see it. We have it, and we get to start dealing with it. The Jesus story invites us to leverage that power, that privilege we have for the sake of those who do not have. To open up that invisible knapsack and just hand out the resources, the advantages, the voice, the power to those who don't have it. To give it away, because in giving it away, we start to change the story. In giving it away, we start living the Jesus story. Just as a final thought, I want to restate what Christina said near the end in the video. It's pretty harsh and direct, and yet I think it really is deeply true. She says this: can you be a privileged person in our society who's not standing in solidarity with the oppressed and actually know Jesus? That's a big question. And she says, no, you can't. There is nothing to your faith if you're not standing in solidarity with the oppressed, because Jesus is standing with the oppressed, and you can't truly see Jesus except through the lens of the oppressed, because that's where Jesus is. So in all of this, and I know this is like some big stuff, we hold these questions that we always ask here at Salt House. We ask, God, what are you saying to me? And God, what am I going to do about it? God never shakes a finger at us to should us and never tells us what to do or scolds us, but it's always invitation. This is an amazing invitation to consider what God is saying to us about the power and the privilege that we have been given. And so we get to hold these questions saying, okay, God, this is the landscape that we live in. And what an amazing example we have to follow. So we ask these questions of how God is meeting us, speaking to us uniquely as we are, with those knapsacks that we carry. So the band's going to come back up, and we always have this time of response to what we're hearing, to ask these questions, to sit in the discomfort and the comfort that we feel, and to sing the song or to listen or to pray. And we're also going to make space within this song of response for confession. That's one of the main things that I heard in the blogs and the other things that I read from our African American sisters and brothers this week. It's like for us to own the privilege that we have.